Hey guys, tonight we step softly across the creaky floorboards of a medieval cottage where the air smells faintly of wood smoke, damp wool, and whatever's fermenting in that bucket over there. A single candle flickers against a wall of woven tapestries. The hearth crackles, and in one corner an elderly woman spins thread with a rhythm so hypnotic it could put an owl to sleep. This, believe it or not, is where your journey begins. You're about to explore the surprisingly intricate, often ridiculous, and somehow deeply soothing world of medieval weaving. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. You don't know how to make thread, you don't know how to work a loom, and your hands are way too soft for peasant labor. But that's okay. We'll get through this together, one stitch at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck your head under a low timber beam and step into the weaving room, though room might be generous. It's more like a glorified broom closet attached to a smoky kitchen. There are bundles of wool hanging from pegs, some dyed in blotchy colors that resemble old soup. A clunky, horizontal loom dominates the corner. It looks like a medieval torture device, but it's actually how they made, well, everything. Clothes, sails, sacks, and yes, those suspiciously crunchy socks. Oh, you noticed those too? Yeah. Medieval socks were rough, literally. Imagine slipping your feet into a wool sleeve made by someone who's never heard of elastic cushioning or deodorant. They were knit thick to survive the chill, but rarely washed. Some peasants owned just one pair, so if it got wet or smelly, tough luck. You wore it anyway, or you walked barefoot, and that wasn't much better. Now, despite the crusty footwear, textiles were everything in medieval life. This wasn't just about fashion, it was survival. Every stitch represented days of labor, often done by candlelight with aching fingers. Your clothing could show off your social class, your village, or whether or not you were about to be accused of witchcraft. Which, was always a fun surprise. You reach out and brush your fingers across a length of coarse cloth stretched taut on the loom. It's scratchy, like wrapping yourself in a potato sack. But this was everyday wear for most folks. Linen for the underlayers, wool for the rest. And no, you couldn't just run to the medieval version of H&M. Each piece was crafted from scratch, literally from a sheep's back to your own. Let's pause there. Imagine the labor pipeline. First, you shear the sheep, who probably isn't thrilled about it. Then you clean the wool, which involves dunking it in water and beating out the lanolin dirt, and, well, let's call them organic surprises. After that, you card it. This step untangles the fibers using brushes covered in tiny metal teeth. It's like combing a wig that's been through a thunderstorm, and you haven't even gotten to spinning yet. You glance over at the spinner in the corner. She's humming softly. Her spindle whirs with a rhythm that seems to vibrate through the floorboards. It's calming, almost sleep-inducing. But don't fall asleep yet. You haven't earned your wool ration. Now here's a fun historical fact to keep your brain busy while your body sinks into the bed. The medieval textile economy was so massive that wool exports were actually England's biggest source of wealth in the 13th and 14th centuries. Not gold, not spices, wool. So if you ever feel like your socks don't matter, remember, they once ran entire nations. Of course, not everyone was making fine garments. The quality varied wildly. Some garments were so coarsely woven you could literally see daylight through them. Others, like those made for nobility, were exquisite, soft, colorful, and stitched with patterns that took months, even years to complete. But you, dear time traveler, are not a noble. You're the new apprentice. And you're about to learn the difference between warp and weft the hard way. Let's keep moving. You crouch beside the loom, squinting to make sense of it. There are threads running vertically. These are the warp threads. They're held under tension, the horizontal threads that weave in and out of them. That's the weft, Warp is fixed. Weft goes back and forth. The terms are Old English, and if you mix them up, someone will yell at you in Middle English, which sounds like a Shakespearean riddle and a sneeze had a baby. Here's something niche. In some regions, women weren't allowed to work the loom. Spinning was women's work. But the heavy-duty looms, male territory. That's because looms, especially the big vertical ones, were physically demanding. It took real leg and arm strength to push the shuttle and operate the heddles. Of course, in other villages, women did it all. Rules varied more than we like to think. Which brings us to an ongoing historical debate. How standardized was textile production across medieval Europe? Some scholars argue that there was significant regional variation, not just in technique, but in who was allowed to do what, when, and how. Others believe the craft followed surprisingly similar methods across borders, spread by traveling merchants and guild regulations. There's no firm answer, just lots of dusty manuscripts and half-deciphered guild codes. But back to you. Yes, you with the aching back and the bruised knees. You've been kneeling at the loom for hours, trying to pass the weft thread through the warp without getting tangled. It's not going great. Your thread snapped, the loom creaked ominously, and your mentor just smacked the back of your head with a spindle. You deserve a break. Someone hands you a mug of warm, suspiciously thick cider. It smells like apples, and regret. Still, you sip it, watching the firelight dance across the wool bundles. Everything feels slow here, intimate, like time is being spun into thread itself. One last fringe detail before we close this section. There were weaving superstitions, lots of them. Some believed that a tangled thread was the sign of an unquiet spirit. Others thought that if you finished a garment at night, it would carry bad luck. And of course, there's the old tale that if you sleep in a garment woven by someone who hates you, well, let's just say, don't expect sweet dreams. You chuckle softly, these people and their threads. But maybe they were onto something. Maybe every thread does carry a bit of the person who made it. A whisper of their world, their hopes, their sore wrists. You glance once more at the old woman in the corner. She's still spinning, still humming, and now you're starting to feel it too. The gentle pull of sleep, the rhythm of thread passing through thread, the quiet, dusty peace of a world woven long ago. You wake up, or maybe you never really fell asleep, and now you're standing in a field, barefoot, surrounded by sheep. One of them is staring at you with an expression that suggests it knows things, ancient things. You blink, and suddenly the field tilts into focus. Coarse grass beneath your feet, mist curling along the hills, and the distant sound of a shepherd whistling a tune that probably hasn't changed in 500 years. This is where your wardrobe begins. The sheep in front of you, a scruffy little fellow with twigs in his wool, is not just grazing for fun. He's the first link in a chain of labor that ends with you, fully clothed, or at least wearing something vaguely resembling a tunic. In the medieval world, clothing didn't just come from a store, it came from the land, the livestock, and a ridiculous amount of human effort. And trust me, you're about to ruin everything by trying to help. You pick up a pair of shears and approach the sheep. He glares. You apologize in advance and make your first snip. The wool comes away like a thick, tangled mat. It's greasy. It smells not great. It clings to your fingers like wet hay. Still, you persist. Snip, snip, snip. Soon enough, the sheep looks like someone gave it a medieval bowl cut during a windstorm. He trots away indignantly, now looking somehow both lighter and more judgmental. Congratulations, you've just harvested raw fleece, but it's not ready for weaving yet, not even close. First, you have to wash it, and here comes your reality check. They didn't have gentle detergent with the lavender scent. They had large vats of water, and in some places they used urine. Yes, actual pee as a cleaning agent. The ammonia in aged urine helps strip lanolin and dirt from the wool. It also helps you lose your appetite. So, win-win, you dunk your freshly shorn fleece into the warm, yellow-tinged liquid. The smell is overpowering, like sour hay, boiled onions, and that time someone microwaved fish in the office kitchen. You stir the wool gently, trying not to think about it too much. Eventually, you rinse it in clean water, if you're lucky enough to have a nearby stream, and lay it out to dry under the sun. Now comes carding. You're handed 2 wooden paddles covered in iron teeth. They look like instruments of torture, and in a way, they are. Your wrists will not forgive you for this. You place a clump of wool on one card and use the other to brush across it over and over, aligning the fibers into smooth, fluffy rolls called rovings. It takes hours. Your arms feel like medieval jelly. You accidentally card your own finger and spend the next 5 minutes questioning your life choices. Still, when you finish, the result is oddly satisfying, like turning a tangled nightmare into a soft, airy dream. You gather the rovings and take them to the spinning corner. There's a spinning wheel, but also a drop spindle, the medieval version of a fidget spinner for overachievers. You're going to try the spindle first. Now pay attention, this is where the real magic happens. You tie a bit of roving to the spindle, give it a flick, and watch as the wool twists into thread. Sort of. Okay, mostly it just snaps or unravels or somehow ties itself around your wrist like a vengeful bracelet. But eventually you find the rhythm. Twist, draw, let the fibers feed. Twist, draw, repeat. It's hypnotic and deeply human because this process, spinning fiber into thread, is as old as civilization itself. Archaeologists have found spindle whorls dating back over 20,000 years. Thread is one of the first technologies. Before wheels, before writing, people were spinning. And here's your historical fact of the night. By the High Middle Ages, the spinning wheel had made its way into Europe from the Islamic world. Likely via Spain, it revolutionized production, allowing faster output than the humble spindle. But for centuries, women still spun thread by hand, often while walking, cooking, or watching children. It was the ever-present background noise of daily life, the low whir of the wheel, the whisper of twisted wool. But of course, where there's spinning, there's drama. One unusual tidbit? In some regions, unmarried women were expected to spin a certain amount of thread to prove their domestic worth. Failure to meet the quota could result in social ridicule, or worse, a suggestion that you were unsuitable for marriage. Imagine being judged for your romantic potential based on how many feet of yarn you could produce. Rough times. And the scholarly debate? Well, it centers around gender roles and labor value. Some argue that spinning was devalued precisely because it was women's work, while others point out that in many rural economies, female spinners were critical to survival and respected for their skill. Records show spinners being paid in coin, in kind, and sometimes with the land privileges. But the details vary wildly depending on location, time period, and social class. Now back to you, and your terribly uneven thread. Your mentor picks it up, inspects it like a jeweler examining a flawed diamond, and raises an eyebrow. Maybe don't try spinning while distracted by the goats next time, she mutters. You nod solemnly. The goats were very distracting. One of them winked at you. It's okay, though. You're learning. Your thread might not be good enough for a nobleman's robe, but it'll make a fine cord for a sack of potatoes. Everyone has to start somewhere. As you gather your wonky skeins and prepare to move on, you notice a small detail on the work table. A worn charm carved from bone shaped like a sheep. It's tied with faded red thread. You ask what it is. Luck, someone says. Turns out spinners often carried small charms or talismans. Some believed they protected the thread from breaking. Others said they kept evil spirits away, or at least distracted enough not to tangle your yarn. Whether superstition or strategy, it's one more thread in the rich tapestry of textile life. You tuck your own bit of red thread into your pocket, just in case. The day is almost done now. The sun spills golden light through the shuttered window. You're sitting cross-legged on the packed earth floor, watching your thread dry, your fingers sore but content. The air smells like wool, wood smoke, and something bubbling in a cauldron that probably shouldn't be bubbling at all. Outside, the sheep are settling in, curling their weird little legs under them like oddly shaped clouds. One of them sneezes dramatically. You think about that first snip, about the path from fleece to fiber to fabric. It's long, it's messy, and it's kind of beautiful. You lean back, eyes heavy, body softening into the hush of twilight. The threads stretch endlessly before you, just waiting to be woven. The morning haze hasn't quite lifted as you wake to the familiar clatter of wood, wool, and weary laughter. The air in the weaving cottage is warmer now, a little sweeter, thick with the smell of yesterday's carded fleece and something vaguely herbal. Maybe lavender, or maybe someone's attempt at covering up the ever-present undertone of sheep. You stretch your arms, feeling the dull ache in your wrists from all the carding and spinning the day before. But there's no time to wallow in your soreness. Today you graduate from spinning to the next level of textile wizardry, actually turning your twisty threads into cloth. You're going to weave, at least that's the plan. First, you have to understand how, and the explanation starts with a contraption that looks like something invented by someone who didn't fully trust gravity. You're led to the loom. It's massive, a sturdy wooden frame the size of a grown horse laid on its side with dozens, maybe hundreds, of threads stretched tightly across its width. These are the warp threads. They're the backbone of the fabric, fixed in place with all the rigidity of a medieval headmaster. And you're about to try to insert the weft threads, the horizontal ones, through this chaos without messing everything up. Spoiler, you are definitely going to mess everything up. The loom groans as you sit at it. There's a wooden frame with vertical posts, foot pedals, a shuttle, and something called heddles, which sound like the name of a local band but are actually crucial to lifting and separating the warp threads. By pressing the pedals, or treadles as they're called, you raise certain warp threads while lowering others, creating a gap known as the shed. That's where you pass the shuttle through, carrying your weft yarn. It sounds simple. It isn't. Your first attempt is clumsy. The shuttle gets stuck halfway through. The shed collapses before you can pull the yarn. You forget to beat the weft in place with the reed. Your warp threads twist like spaghetti. By the time you're done with your first few inches of cloth, it looks more like a woolen spider gave up halfway through a panic attack. Your mentor sighs loudly. "At least you didn't break the shuttle," she mutters. "Small victories. Here's your historical fun fact while you recover. By the late Middle Ages, some looms had become surprisingly sophisticated. Horizontal treadle looms allowed weavers to work seated, using foot pedals to speed up production. This innovation came to Europe from China by way of Islamic Spain and completely changed the game, especially for guild workshops that were churning out fabric for the growing merchant class. And speaking of guilds, some weaving operations were tiny, just a family in a cottage, but others were more structured. Part of powerful craft guilds that controlled standards, prices, and training. In major cities like Paris or Florence, guilds could dictate who could weave, what they could weave, and how much they could charge. They even conducted inspections. Imagine someone barging into your home to check if your textiles met municipal quality control. Medieval quality assurance, folks. Very serious business. But back to you. Your shuttle handling is improving, slowly, painfully, but it's happening. You're beginning to feel the rhythm. Press, lift, pass, beat. Press, lift, pass, beat. There's a meditative quality to it, almost like a loom-powered lullaby. The threads hum beneath your fingers. The air fills with that soft, fibrous tension, the kind that seems to soak into your bones and remind you that, yes, you're definitely going to need a shoulder massage after this. Now, for your oddball tidbit of the day. In some areas of medieval Europe, weaving was considered slightly magical. Not in a fireball hurling way, but in the quiet, mystical sense of creation. Turning loose thread into usable cloth felt like sorcery to many. There were even weaving charms and incantations whispered over looms to prevent snags and breaks. Some weavers refused to work during eclipses, believing the fabric woven under a cursed sky would cause illness or misfortune. And if your loom creaked at night on its own, best not to ask why. Weaving wasn't just labor, it was lore. You're getting the hang of it now. Your fabric has structure. It might not be beautiful, but it's respectable. Something you could maybe sell at the local fair for a handful of coins or a very polite chicken. Your mentor grunts in approval, then she tells you to undo it and start over. Apparently, it's traditional to rip out your early efforts so you don't get too attached to mistakes. It builds humility, and maybe a little rage. As you unwind your crooked tapestry back into thread, you stare at the loom with narrowed eyes. You'll beat it. One day. For now, you're just grateful it didn't collapse on top of you. Now, a bit of context for your scholarly side. Historians still debate how much of medieval textile production was done for personal use versus commercial trade. While many peasants made their own cloth, there's ample evidence of thriving rural industry, particularly in areas like Flanders, where textiles were exported across Europe. Some even argue that these proto-industrial setups were the early precursors of capitalism, with entire towns centered on looms, dyers, and merchants. But let's zoom back in. You stand up, flexing your aching legs. The day is almost done. You've woven about a foot of cloth. Not great, not terrible. It's thick, uneven, and smells faintly of sheep. But it's real. You made it. And in this era, that's something to be proud of. You hang the fabric on a line to rest. It needs to settle, your mentor says. Cloth, like bread dough, benefits from a little time to breathe. You step outside, the sun now glowing gold against the stone walls of the village. Smoke curls from chimneys. Someone is playing a flute, terribly. Somewhere nearby, a chicken is deeply offended, and you feel oddly peaceful. There's something comforting about this world. The slowness, the tactile rhythm, the idea that even the humblest weaver contributes to something larger. A sail, a shroud, a wedding dress, a baby's blanket. It's all just thread, twisted, woven, worn. You run your hand along the frame of the loom one last time. The wood is smooth, polished by decades of use. It creaks softly, as if acknowledging you. You wonder how many other apprentices sat here, how many prayers were whispered into the warp, how many hopes were sown quietly into the weft. You yawn, not because you're bored, though, let's be honest, this is boring history, but because the weaving has worked its spell. Your mind drifts, your muscles soften. You think about wool, about tension, about the way each thread needs the others to become something whole. A gust of wind flutters the drying cloth like a flag, and just like that, it's time to rest. The rooster crowed approximately 2 hours ago, and no one has stopped moving since. You, on the other hand, have only just rubbed the sleep from your eyes and stepped groggily back into the weaving room, greeted by the same heady scent of singed wool, wood smoke, and the vague promise of breakfast that never quite materializes. Today you're not spinning, not carding, and for a blessed moment, you're not rethreading any warp that mysteriously unraveled itself in the middle of the night. Nope. Today you're learning the thing that every experienced weaver claims to understand, but no one can seem to explain clearly in under 2 hours. Warp and weft theory. You glance at the loom. It looms back. Let's start simple. The warp threads are vertical. They're fixed. They go on the loom first, tied under tension so tight that one false move can send the whole framework into a tangled medieval mess. Think of them as the skeleton, the permanent structure. The weft threads are the horizontal ones woven over and under the warp to form the fabric. Like the flesh on a body, they wrap around, shape, and fill in the gaps. So warp is your foundation, weft is your flow. You nod as your mentor explains this. Then she asks you to calculate the number of warp threads needed for a tunic, the correct spacing based on yarn thickness, and the length to accommodate shrinkage during fulling. Your brain exits the conversation immediately. You stare blankly at the bundle of yarn in your lap and seriously consider going back to being a goat herder. But you persevere. You're here for the long game. And this is just the warm-up. Let's slide in a historical reality check to keep you grounded. During the 12th to 15th centuries, this knowledge, warp width, thread weight, tension ratios, wasn't considered esoteric. It was everyday survival. Weaving was essential. Everyone needed clothes, and the ability to weave was in many places more valuable than the ability to read, which, let's be honest, isn't saying much considering literacy rates among peasants hovered near hopeful guessing. But back to the warp threads, which you are now attempting to string evenly across the beam of the loom. You've tied the first few knots with care. Too much tension and they'll snap like angry harp strings. Too little, and your weft thread will sag, producing what your mentor refers to lovingly as wobbly disgrace fabric. You feel like the loom is judging you again. Now here's a fringe detail to brighten your day. In some communities, warp and weft had symbolic meanings. The warp was said to represent fate, fixed, unavoidable, the path laid out by the gods. The weft, that was choice, free will, the way you move through life within those constraints. This metaphor shows up in Norse mythology, in Greek myth, hello fates and their golden thread, and even in some Christian mystic texts. Life, it turns out, was often imagined as a giant woven tapestry, and you were just a thread in it. So if you mess up today's weave, it's not just a tunic, it's your destiny unraveling. No pressure. You sit down at the loom and begin again. This time, you're more methodical. You double-check your heddles, the loops that lift your warp threads, and make sure the reed is in place to press the weft tight. Every movement has purpose. Pedals pressed, shed opened, shuttle passed, reed slammed. It's like playing a silent, rhythmic instrument. The cloth builds slowly beneath your hands. At first, it's plain weave, simple over-under patterns that look boring but hold strong. Then your mentor shows you how to make patterns using different lifting sequences: twill, herringbone, diamond weave. Suddenly, you're painting in yarn. And yes, it's only two colors, gray and darker gray. But still, you feel like a wizard. Here's your official historical fact. Twill weave was a popular pattern in medieval Europe because it created a fabric that was both flexible and durable. Think of your favorite pair of jeans, that's twill. Many cloaks, hose, and coats from the period used this technique. Especially when wool was the main fiber, it resisted wear, draped nicely, and could be made thick or light depending on the need. Useful, practical, and kind of stylish in that I live in a damp stone building sort of way. Of course, not everything about weaving was noble or pleasant. Let's talk about the weaver's back, or rather the way a weaver's back ceased to function properly after a few years of this. Weaving is grueling, hours spent seated, hunched over a loom, legs working the treadles, arms constantly in motion. It's the medieval version of being chained to a standing desk, but with none of the ergonomic awareness. Some historical accounts describe weavers with twisted spines, knotted muscles, and joints that clicked like bad cartwheels. And yet, they kept weaving, because someone had to. Now, the ongoing scholarly debate for this section, it's about whether loom weaving, especially more complex pattern work, was typically learned through formal apprenticeships or passed down informally within families. Some argue that only guild members could legally sell patterned cloth, requiring years of regulated training. Others point to strong oral and visual traditions in rural communities where mothers taught daughters, and sometimes sons. Patterns were memorized through repetition, and no one needed a license to make a tunic that wouldn't fall apart. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Official training in towns, oral tradition in villages. Either way, if you couldn't weave, your winter wardrobe was going to be very cold and very see-through. But let's return to your hands, which are now moving with increasing confidence. You finished about 3 feet of fabric. It's not perfect, but it's tight, even, and holding together beautifully. A peasant's robe? Absolutely. A noble's tunic? Not yet, but you're getting there. You lean back, exhausted, as your mentor inspects your work. Better, she says. You'll make a decent weaver before your teeth fall out. That's the nicest thing she's ever said to you. You smile, or maybe grimace. It's hard to tell when your whole body hurts. Outside, the sun has dipped behind the trees. The wind carries the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread. Somewhere, a bell rings in the monastery tower. And inside the cottage, the loom sits silent, your cloth still stretched across it. A quiet monument to the hours you've just woven into history. You run your fingers across the fabric. It's warm. It holds the heat of your labor, your frustration, your tiny triumphant joy. You wonder if someone, centuries from now, will find a scrap of it in the dirt and marvel at the hands that made it. Maybe they'll even imagine you. This awkward, sleepy weaver with dreams of greatness and fingers full of splinters. You exhale slowly, the light fades, the yarn waits. The rhythm will begin again tomorrow, but for tonight, you rest. It's not even dawn when you're nudged awake by the gentle clack of wood on wood. In the half-dark, the old loom creaks like a ship at sea, rocking softly with the press of pedals and the swing of the shuttle. You sit up, groggy, your blanket smelling faintly of sheep and smoke, and blink at the ghostly silhouette hunched over the loom. Your mentor, already several inches into the day's weaving. "Thought I told you to fix the warp tension before sleep," she mutters, without turning around. So much for easing into the morning. You rub your eyes, toss on your slightly less crusty tunic, and shuffle toward the loom. Today's lesson, it turns out, is not about the cloth itself. It's about the machine, because as your mentor so eloquently puts it, you can't work the beast until you understand the beast. Welcome to Loom Mechanics 101, a crash course in medieval wood engineering, a bit of rope sorcery, and just enough grease to make everything smell vaguely like boiled walnuts. First, you crawl under the loom. It's dark, dusty, there are cobwebs. A spider, who is clearly the landlord down here, glares at you. You nod respectfully, an inch further in, inspecting the foot pedals connected to the heddles via thick cords. When you press a pedal, the cords tug specific heddles upward, lifting their warped threads. The idea is to create a clean, open shed where the shuttle can pass without catching. That's the theory. In reality, one of the heddles is tied with a knot that looks like it was invented by a drunk sailor, and you're pretty sure someone used part of a chicken's foot as a cord anchor. The medieval loom is, in short, a magnificent wooden beast held together by tension, friction, and stubbornness. And it works. Barely. You emerge from beneath it, sneezing and covered in lint. But wiser, your mentor hands you a hammer, not for punishment this time, but for maintenance. You tighten a peg, adjust the beater bar, oil the joints. Every thump and squeak becomes a tiny act of preservation. Now here's your historical fact. The most common loom in medieval Europe was the horizontal treadle loom, particularly by the 13th century, but in earlier times the vertical warp-weighted loom was still popular, especially in Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe. Instead of tensioning threads with beams and pegs, they used literal rocks, yes, rocks, tied to the warp threads to keep them taut. Imagine weaving while dozens of stones dangle below your work. Like some kind of textile marionette show, it worked, slowly. Which brings us to a surprisingly spicy piece of fringe history. Looms were loud. The repetitive thunk-thunk of the beater, the slap of pedals, the creak of wood. Multiply that by several weavers working in one cottage or hall, and you've got the medieval equivalent of a textile drum circle. This led to some funny ordinances. In a few towns, weavers were forbidden to work during church services because the noise interfered with the prayers. You can almost hear it. Loom beats echoing down stone alleys, monks glaring through stained glass windows, peasants muttering, "There they go again," with their tunics. Speaking of tunics, as the sun climbs higher and your fingers regain some feeling, your mentor points to a worn cloak hanging on a peg. "That," she says, "was woven right here, for a night." You study it. The fabric is dense, dark, slightly glossy from years of wear. The weave is so tight it could probably stop a sneeze at close range, which in medieval times was basically armor. Knights wore woven wool cloaks lined with fur or linen, sometimes dyed deep colors like crimson or green to show wealth. No polyester, no Gore-Tex, just layers of carefully crafted thread, and a surprising amount of lanolin left in for waterproofing. Which brings us to a curious scholarly debate. How much lanolin did medieval weavers leave in their wool? Some argue that for outerwear, the wool was only lightly washed, leaving a protective layer of grease that repelled rain. Others say that fine cloth, especially for nobles, was fully scoured to remove the lanolin, then brushed, sheared, and even fulled to create a smooth, soft finish. The answer likely depends on the fabric's purpose. Battle cloak? Keep it greasy. Banquet gown? Clean it till it glows. You run your hands along the knight's cloak again. It's heavy, real, and more than a little intimidating. But you don't have time to admire it for long. Your mentor claps her hands and points to your loom. That's your historical fact of the day. In places like Flanders and Florence, women were often officially barred from high guild ranks. But unofficially, they were essential. Many worked in putting out systems where merchants supplied raw materials to women at home, who then spun, wove, or sewed finished goods for sale. It was decentralized, efficient, and very much female-powered. Back in the workshop, one woman, who you're pretty sure could silence a dragon with a glance, pulls you aside and hands you a brush. "We're finishing a bolt for market," she says. "Don't ruin it. No pressure. Your task is fulling, beating woven cloth to make it thicker and denser. In posher towns, they had water-powered mills for this. But here, it's done by hand. You dip the cloth in warm water mixed with fuller's earth, a type of clay, then pound it repeatedly with a wooden mallet. The idea is to tighten the weave, make it fluffier, and slightly felt the fibers. Your arms will feel like you've wrestled a sheep and lost. As you beat the cloth, one of the women leans over and says with a grin, "Some say fulling was a punishment in the afterlife. Eternity with damp wool and sore elbows." You're inclined to believe it. Still, the cloth changes in your hands. It softens, thickens, grows stronger. It's a strange sort of alchemy, like turning fuzz into armor. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some medieval weavers believed the energy you put into fulling would stay in the cloth. They whispered blessings or curses over the fabric, and just like that, you start to wonder if your mallet is striking with a little too much attitude. You ease up, just in case. Now let's talk guilds. Most major cities had guilds, organizations that regulated trades. For textile workers, this meant rules on pricing, apprenticeships, dyes, cloth measurements, even working hours. Guilds protected quality, but also limited competition. In towns where women weren't allowed to join, they often worked in shadow systems, selling through male relatives, using forged stamps, or creating entirely separate networks. But in some places, like parts of Germany, England, and Italy, women were members. They even had their own sub-guilds. Lace makers, spinners, and dyers sometimes formed associations that rivaled the male-run ones. The historical debate? Whether these roles were truly empowering or simply extensions of domestic labor disguised as economic freedom. Some scholars argue that women were entrepreneurs in their own right. Others point out that their labor was still often undervalued, underpaid, and unrecorded. Back in the workshop, you pause to watch one woman thread a needle with gold-wrapped thread. Her embroidery dances across the fabric in tiny stitches, forming vines, beasts, and sacred symbols. You ask her what it's for. "A priest stole," she replies. "They'll bless it, but I'll know whose fingers made it holy." That line sticks with you. Because behind every grand robe in a cathedral, behind every lord's velvet tunic, there's someone like her, anonymous, overlooked, tired, but brilliant. You spend the rest of the afternoon helping prepare a length of cloth for market. You brush it, you cut the uneven edges, you fold it precisely, measuring with your fingers in a worn piece of knotted string. It's all done with ceremony, not because it's fancy, but because it matters. This is someone's future cloak, someone's dowry, someone's shroud. You begin to understand. You don't just make fabric here. You mark time. Births, deaths, celebrations, losses, they're all wrapped in cloth. And it's often women who weave those moments into existence. As the light fades and candles flicker to life, someone uncorks a bottle of something strong and fruity. The women toast their week's labor. You sip, smile, and laugh as they argue over whose cloth was most evenly tensioned and whether red or blue sells better in spring. Eventually, the workshop quiets. Some women begin winding skeins for tomorrow. Others wrap their shawls tighter and step into the night. One offers you a scrap of cloth. Your first contribution, pressed and folded into a neat little square. You turn it over in your hand. It's soft. dyed deep green. One edge is slightly crooked, the other is embroidered with a single thread, looped into the shape of a tiny spiral. "Practice stitch," the woman says, "but every stitch is a memory, yes?" You nod, because, yes, you understand now. You sit by the hearth, your legs aching, the fire cracking low. Outside, the village winds down. The wind whistles through thatch and chimney. You imagine this little workshop, this haven of threads and laughter, still humming centuries from now. You close your eyes, the cloth in your hand still warm from the press of hers. It smells faintly of dye, of wool, of effort. It smells like something real. The sun is barely peeking over the horizon when you find yourself standing next to a steaming vat filled with an odd purple liquid that smells somewhere between rotten grapes and a wet dog. You wrinkle your nose but remind yourself, this is medieval dyeing, and if you want color, you're going to have to get used to weird smells and stranger ingredients. Welcome to the fascinating, sometimes nauseating world of medieval dyes, where the color of your cloak was a statement and sometimes a biohazard. The workshop you step into is fragrant, in a way only a mixture of animal urine, crushed insects, and boiled plants can be. Skeins of yarn hang on racks, waiting to soak in vats of mysterious liquids. One woman stirs a bubbling cauldron filled with what looks like fermented cabbage. Another carefully drops handfuls of crushed cochineal bugs into a pot of boiling water. And then there's the pee. Yes, urine. The medieval laundromat wasn't all soap and suds. In fact, ammonia-rich stale urine was a prized ingredient in dyeing wool, especially in the production of bright colors and to help fix dyes to fibers. Sometimes it was collected from chamber pots stored in barrels. Other times, more industrious townsfolk even set up public urine collection points because, well, they knew their colors. You take a deep breath and try to convince your nose that this is all perfectly normal. Spoiler alert, it's not. But that's medieval life. Here's your historical fact for this stinky story. One of the most prized medieval dyes was woad, a blue pigment made from crushing the leaves of a European plant. Woad produced a bright blue similar to indigo, but it required multiple baths and was notoriously tricky to fix onto wool. That's where the urine came in. The ammonia helped the dye bind better to the fibers, resulting in a longer-lasting, vibrant blue. If you're wondering about the famous blue of medieval knights' cloaks or the rich blues in tapestries, a lot of that came down to woad and the urine vats that made it possible. Now, for the fringe tidbit, in some places dyeing was believed to be a magical process. Dyers often carried protective charms and performed little rituals to ward off bad luck, broken threads, or even poisonous fumes. There are accounts of dyers' guilds forbidding certain colors on particular days or during specific lunar phases. Some colors were said to repel evil spirits, while others were thought to bring misfortune if worn by the wrong person. So dyeing wasn't just science. It was superstition dyed in deep reds and blues. You cautiously dip a skein of wool into a vat of diluted urine mixed with crushed madder root, which gives a rusty red color. The wool swells and sinks slowly, soaking in the pigment. You lift it out, dripping and vibrant. The color feels alive, like the wool itself has been transformed into something magical. Of course, not every dye bath was safe. Some dyes contained toxic heavy metals or poisonous plants. Without modern ventilation or protective gear, dyers often suffered chronic health problems, but the show had to go on. Speaking of which, here's an ongoing scholarly debate. Historians argue over how much dyeing knowledge was preserved and shared between cultures. Was medieval European dyeing an isolated craft, reinvented time and again, or did dyers actively trade secrets along trade routes, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, from Persia to England? Some evidence suggests a fascinating exchange of techniques, especially through the Moorish presence in Spain, which introduced advanced dyeing methods. Others contend that much dyeing remained localized, with knowledge jealously guarded within families or guilds. Back in the workshop, you try not to gag as you prepare a batch of beetroot dye, a vibrant pinkish purple that stains everything it touches. You're warned that beetroot dye fades quickly in sunlight, but it's popular because it's cheap and safe. Still, it won't earn you any compliments. As you pull the dyed skeins from the vats, the colors bleed into one another. Strands of deep indigo mingle with bright reds and earthy yellows. The wool smells like a medieval spice market crossed with a farmyard. Your fingers are stained, your nose is numb, and your head is starting to spin slightly from the fumes. You step outside, gulp fresh air, and watch as a pair of dyed skeins flutter in the breeze like colorful flags. A woman nearby chuckles and says, "Don't worry, the smell fades, eventually, and if it doesn't, well, you'll just blend in with the sheep." You grin weakly. The hours pass in a blur of stirring, dipping, rinsing, and drying. You learn that every dye has its quirks. Some require multiple dips, others need to be heated just so, and a few demand a bath in metal salts, called mordants, to fix the color. Your hands turn every shade of the rainbow as you work. In the background, the women gossip about the latest market prices for dyed cloth, how the new tax on woad is squeezing profits, and the scandal of a dyer caught stealing precious cochineal from a rival. And as the day wears on, you realize something. Dyeing isn't just about color, it's about control, status, identity. Wearing blue might mark you as a merchant. Red might show you're wealthy or dangerous. Yellow could mean you're a fool or a sinner, or perhaps just fashionable. Colors in medieval society were political, social, and deeply personal. You look down at your hands, stained purple and red, and feel a strange pride. You have become part of the tapestry of medieval life. And for a moment, the smell doesn't seem quite so bad. The morning sun pours through the small, leaded windows of the weaving workshop, casting patchwork shadows on the wooden floor. You're still nursing your stained fingers and lingering headache from yesterday's dye baths. But today calls for a different kind of challenge, weaving patterns, plaids, and the curious world of medieval textiles as expressions of identity. As you step toward the loom, your mentor greets you with a knowing smile. Today you'll learn to make your mark, not just with thread, but with meaning. You frown because all you see is a jumble of threads, but she's right. Patterns were everything. You begin with checks and stripes, the simplest forms. But behind those simple designs lies a complex code. Colors, lines, and shapes signaled everything from family allegiance to regional pride, and sometimes a carefully disguised insult. Let's start with plaids. You might recognize them today as tartan, famously worn by Scottish clans. But tartan patterns as clan identifiers are a more modern invention, at least that's what some historians argue. The debate is lively. Some scholars say medieval tartans were random or practical, woven from available colors and materials. Others point to surviving samples and written accounts suggesting early forms of clan or regional patterns existed much earlier. You're stuck in the middle of this debate as you try to replicate a simple checked pattern on your loom. The process requires setting up the warp threads and repeating color sequences, then carefully passing the weft in matching order. One misstep and the pattern collapses like a house of cards. Your fingers fumble, the shuttle catches on a loose thread, the edges of the fabric curl. But your mentor pats your shoulder and says, even the greatest weavers start with mistakes. Patterns weren't just pretty designs, they were visual language. In medieval Europe, they served as badges of identity. Noble families had specific colors and emblems woven into their clothes and banners. Townsfolk wore local styles to distinguish themselves from neighbors. Certain patterns even indicated profession or status. You notice an embroidered motif on a nearby sleeve, a stylized lily, a symbol associated with French royalty. Its presence marks the wearer as someone with allegiance to the crown, or at least aspirations to be near it. Now here's an unusual fact. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially the Low Countries, weaving was tied to political rebellion. Certain color combinations or patterns were banned or deemed seditious because they represented opposition factions. Weaving, it turns out, could be a subtle form of protest. You catch yourself wondering if any weavers ended up in trouble for their wrong patterns. Probably. The whole workshop buzzes with energy as you attempt a diamond weave. twisting the threads this way and that to create subtle texture differences. It's intricate work, requiring intense focus, but it's also meditative. Each pass of the shuttle like a whispered secret. Here's a scholarly debate to keep you company. Some historians argue that medieval pattern textiles were primarily functional, designed to create stronger fabric with less wear. Others emphasize their symbolic and social role, noting that surviving examples were carefully preserved and displayed. The truth? It's a blend. Form and function intertwined in the fabric of daily life. As you work, your mentor pulls out a roll of fabric adorned with bold stripes and diamond checks. This, she says, was made for a merchant's son. Fashion and function, all in one. You marvel at the precision. The colors are faded but still vibrant. The pattern tells a story, wealth, ambition, and a subtle nod to continental styles from Italy and Flanders. You ask if this kind of fabric was common. Not for peasants, she replies, mostly for the emerging middle class, merchants, artisans, and those who wanted to be seen. You nod slowly, feeling the weight of those threads, how something as simple as colored lines could shift social boundaries. After hours of weaving, you finally finish your first patterned piece. It's rough, but recognizable. You hold it up proudly. Your mentor beams. See, you're not just weaving cloth. You're weaving identity. You fold your fabric carefully, thinking about all the stories locked in those patterns, about how something as mundane as thread could carry meaning, power, and sometimes even rebellion. As the workshop quiets and dusk settles, you watch the last skeins dry on the line. The colors shimmer in the fading light, and you realize weaving was never just about cloth. It was about people, about belonging, about marking your place in a complicated, colorful world. You feel the threads in your hands, soft, strong, full of history, and you smile. The morning sun slips through your window, casting golden light on a dusty pile of fabric stretched and folded on a rough wooden table. You lean in closer and start counting threads, feeling the surprisingly delicate texture of woven cloth. It's your job now to understand what those numbers mean, not just for fabric strength, but for status, comfort, and survival. Welcome to the world of thread counts and royal pillowcases, where the thickness and fineness of a fabric could be the difference between being a noble or a nobody. You start by learning to count warp threads per inch, a basic but crucial skill. It's a painstaking process, requiring a steady eye and patience. Some cloth is coarse and open, easy to see each thread. Other fabric is so tightly woven that it looks almost like silk, though medieval silk was a rare and exotic luxury. Your mentor shows you a bolt of fine linen painstakingly woven for a noble's bed linens. See how the threads are almost invisible, she whispers. This is the kind of cloth kings sleep on. You imagine the king turning over on this fabric, the soft rustle like whispers of power and privilege. Meanwhile, peasants might be lucky to have burlap sacks or coarse woolen blankets that itch so much they'd rather sleep outside. Here's your historical fact. Medieval Europe prized fine linen for bed linens and undergarments. The finest linens could have thread counts exceeding 100 threads per inch, rivaling modern Egyptian cotton. These linens were labor-intensive to produce, requiring carefully cleaned flax fibers, delicate spinning, and skilled weaving. They were status symbols, often embroidered with family crests or religious motifs. But the story doesn't end with thread counts. You also learn about fulling, washing and beating fabric to make it thicker and softer. Nobles expected their linens to be fulled to a smooth finish, while common folk had rougher, coarser materials. Now, a fringe detail. Some scholars suggest that medieval pillowcases and linens were sometimes perfumed with herbs or oils to mask the less than pleasant scents of the time. Rosemary, lavender, and mint were favorites, tucked into pillows and sheets to bring a touch of freshness, or at least an illusion of it. You wonder if anyone ever woke up sneezing in their fancy bed, cursed the perfumer, and decided they'd sleep under the stars instead. The scholarly debate. It circles around the true availability of fine linens to the middle class. Some argue that the nobility and wealthy clergy monopolized high-quality fabrics, while others point to wills and inventory, suggesting that prosperous merchants and artisans also enjoyed access to finer linens, especially in thriving urban centers. Back at the workshop, your eyes strain as you compare samples. One fabric is scratchy and uneven, another is smooth and luxurious. You feel the weight of social division stitched into every fiber. Your mentor hands you a pillowcase embroidered with a delicate pattern, tiny crosses and fleur-de-lis stitched in silk thread. This, she says, was meant for a bishop's bed. You wonder how many prayers were whispered beneath that cloth, how many nights of contemplation, how many dreams spun under such fabric. Later, you try to weave a small piece with a higher thread count. It's slow going. You fumble with the warp tension, your fingers clumsy with fine thread. The fabric starts to take shape, tighter and finer than anything you've woven before. It's difficult work, but rewarding. You realize that the art of thread counting wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. It was about care, patience, and devotion. You think about the people who made these fabrics, the spinners, weavers, fullers, and embroiderers, each one contributing to the texture of medieval life, literally and figuratively. You fold your fabric carefully, feeling the contrast between rough and smooth, poor and privileged. Outside, a gentle breeze carries the scent of hay and distant smoke. Somewhere a child laughs. The world spins, as it always does. You feel the fabric against your skin and understand this cloth carries stories of kings and commoners, of prayers and promises, of warmth and dreams. And in this quiet moment, you're part of that story too. You wake to the murmur of village life, the crowing cocks, the clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestone, and, faint but persistent, the grinding wheel of the blacksmith. Your limbs ache a little less today thanks to an unexpected burst of sleep, but the task ahead promises new challenges. Today you'll delve into the great divide between the peasant's tunic and the noble's robes. Spoiler, it's not just fabric or cut. It's the language of power whispered in wool and silk. You step into the weaving room where two garments hang side by side. One is rough, gray, and obviously hand-me-down, the kind of tunic a farmhand might wear. The other glows with deep crimson and gold embroidery, trimmed in fur, and so finely woven it almost seems to shimmer in the dim candlelight. This, your mentor explains, is the noble's robe, a symbol as loud as any herald's trumpet. The peasant's tunic is made from coarse wool, woven with thick threads and little finesse. It's designed for function, to endure the endless toil of fields and animal care. Its weave is loose to allow movement and breath in the summer heat, but it offers little protection from cold. The colors are muted, dyed with whatever was available, mostly browns and dull greens. Washes are rare and repairs frequent, with patches of mismatched fabric stitched on over the years. The tunic tells a story of hard labor, resilience, and a life entwined with the earth. In stark contrast, the noble's robe is a tapestry of wealth and status. The fabric is fine wool or velvet, often imported, with threads so tightly woven the surface feels almost like glass. Colors here are bright, achieved with expensive dyes like indigo and madder. The robe is trimmed with costly furs, sable, ermine, or marten, reserved strictly for those with privilege. Embroidered motifs show family crests, heraldic symbols, or religious iconography weaving identity into every stitch. Wearing such robes was not just a fashion statement, but a public declaration of power, lineage, and alliance. Here's your historical fact for this textile tale. Sumptuary laws were common across medieval Europe. These laws regulated who could wear what, controlling access to luxurious fabrics, colors, and furs to maintain social hierarchies. For example, in England during the 14th century, only the king and certain nobles could wear cloth of gold or ermine trim, while commoners were forbidden to wear bright colors or expensive materials. Breaking these laws could mean fines or even imprisonment. You reach out and tentatively touch the noble's robe. The embroidery is delicate yet firm under your fingers, and the fabric feels impossibly smooth. You imagine how heavy it must be to wear such a garment all day, especially under the heat of a crowded hall or a blazing hearth. Now for your fringe tidbit. Despite the rigidity of sumptuary laws, people were resourceful. Some peasants dyed their wool with homemade recipes to imitate brighter colors, using crushed berries, bark, or even onion skins. Others layered rough fabrics or used patches to spruce up worn garments, turning necessity into accidental fashion statements. In some cases, servants wore livery, uniforms of their lord's colors, that were technically forbidden by law, but tolerated as a sign of household affiliation. And then there's the scholarly debate. Historians argue about how strictly sumptuary laws were enforced, especially outside the major cities. Some believe the laws were widely ignored or circumvented, while others argue they were vital tools of social control, reinforced by community pressure and legal sanctions. There's also debate about whether these laws reinforce class distinctions or simply reflected existing social realities. Back in the workshop, your mentor hands you a length of fine wool, dyed deep burgundy. Try weaving a sleeve for a noble, she says, and then one for a peasant. Feel the difference? You attempt the noble's sleeve first. The thread is thin and slippery, demanding delicate handling. You concentrate on maintaining even tension and precise patterning, mindful of the extra work embroidered later. It's painstaking and slow. Then you switch to the peasant's sleeve. The wool is rough, thick, and resilient. The weave is simpler and quicker to produce, but the fabric has character. Visible knots and unevenness that speak of honest labor. You hold both sleeves up to the light. One is sleek and refined, the other sturdy and practical. Neither is better. Both serve their purpose. Later, you overhear villagers gossiping about the new robe a visiting lord's wife wore during the last feast, how the emerald green of her dress shimmered like a forest canopy, and her fur stole was rumored to be from the rarest sable. The villagers whisper envy and admiration, their own homes filled with coarse blankets and patchy tunics. You understand then that clothes were never just clothes. They were stories of ambition, constraint, and survival. As the day ends, you sit by the fire, mulling over these fabrics that tell so much. You touch the edges of your own clothes, simple, worn, but yours. And you feel connected to everyone who's ever woven thread into identity, from the farmhand to the monarch. You smile, knowing tomorrow brings more weaving, more stories, more history, stitched in wool. The sun has begun its slow descent beyond the distant hills, casting the workshop into a quiet twilight. You find yourself drawn to a corner where a massive tapestry hangs. Its colors faded, but its stories still vivid. This isn't just fabric, it's history woven in wool and silk. A medieval meme long before memes were a thing. Tapestries in the Middle Ages weren't merely decorative. They were portable walls, storytelling devices, and status symbols. Some told biblical tales, others celebrated heroic battles, while a few, frankly, looked like someone had a very strange dream involving knights, mythical beasts, and awkwardly shaped horses. You gaze closer, fascinated by the sheer scale. The tiny stitches form sprawling scenes, people riding horses, feasting, and occasionally a very large, very confused-looking dragon. You chuckle softly, imagining the tapestry's maker having a particularly odd daydream. Here's a historical fact. The Bayeux Tapestry, probably the most famous medieval tapestry, is nearly 230 feet long and chronicles the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Despite being called a tapestry, it's technically an embroidery stitched onto linen. Tapestries like this were not only art but political propaganda, crafted to glorify rulers and commemorate events. You touch the fabric gently, marveling at the craftsmanship. Each thread represents hours, days, months of labor, often by skilled artisans who remained anonymous. The tapestries traveled with noble families decorating castles and halls, adding warmth and grandeur. But beyond grandeur, tapestries were practical. Stone castles were drafty, cold and echoing. Hanging thick woolen cloth on walls helped insulate rooms, muffled sounds, and protected inhabitants from chill winds. Now the fringe detail. Medieval tapestry makers often included hidden jokes or Easter eggs in their work. In some scenes, animals have comically exaggerated features. Some figures make faces at the viewer. Others include humorous details like cats chasing mice or peasants sneaking off for a break. These details remind us that even in the stiff formality of medieval art, there was room for playfulness. One intriguing scholarly debate centers on how tapestries were produced. Were they designed and woven by a small team of specialists under the patron supervision, or was the work more collaborative and community-driven? Some argue for centralized workshops, while others suggest itinerant weavers traveled with the tapestries, repairing and embellishing them over time. As you watch, a woman near you begins unraveling a small section of tapestry, skillfully repairing a tear. Her fingers work deftly, matching colors thread by thread. She tells you that repairing tapestries was an essential skill because these artworks were expensive and long-lasting investments. Each patch and stitch added to the tapestry story. You imagine the layers of history, stories woven not just in the original creation, but in every repair, every restored color, every added detail. You lean back, the hum of the workshop around you. The tapestry's colors blur softly in the fading light, and you feel the weight of centuries in its threads. A small joke crosses your mind. Medieval horses had better dental care than their riders, but their anatomy and tapestries. Let's just say the artists had creative license. You chuckle quietly, thinking of that giant dragon's awkward grin from earlier. You're reminded of another humor note. The fool figure, a common character in medieval tapestries and manuscripts, often depicted with a floppy hat and a mischievous grin. He was a subtle reminder not to take life, or tapestry, too seriously. As the day ends, you realize tapestries were more than art. They were stories, warmth, jokes, and history, all woven into fabric to be touched and seen. And in their threads, the voices of medieval lives whisper still. The air outside is thick with the scent of spice and silk as you embark on a journey, one that stretches far beyond the cozy weaving workshop and into the bustling, sun-soaked markets of the medieval trade routes. Today you follow the thread of silk, that luxurious fabric that traveled thousands of miles, linking continents, cultures, and craftspeople in an intricate web of commerce and intrigue. You imagine yourself walking alongside camel caravans, crossing the Silk Road, where precious bolts of silk, woven in distant lands by master artisans, were bartered for gold, spices, and tales of faraway kingdoms. The fabric glimmers like liquid moonlight, soft as a whisper but coveted by kings and queens alike. Here's your historical fact. Medieval Europe imported silk primarily from Byzantium and later from the Islamic world, before Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa became major silk traders. The demand for silk was so high that it fueled expansive trade networks stretching from China through Central Asia and into the Mediterranean. Owning silk wasn't just about comfort, it was a symbol of power, wealth, and worldly connection. You touch a small scrap of silk, a rare treasure in the medieval workshop. It feels almost magical, cool, smooth, and shimmering with iridescence. You wonder about the hands that spun its delicate threads, about the silkworms nurtured on mulberry leaves thousands of miles away. But silk was more than just beauty, it was drama. The trade routes were fraught with danger. Bandits, political upheaval, and natural disasters threatened the precious cargo. Control over silk production and trade often meant wealth and influence, causing rivalries and even wars. The Byzantine Empire famously guarded its silk secrets jealously, attempting to monopolize the craft. According to legend, 2 monks smuggled silkworm eggs hidden in bamboo poles out of China, kickstarting European silk production. The scholarly debate around silk in medieval Europe centers on how much local production existed versus imports. Some argue that European silk weaving began earlier than traditionally thought, influenced by Eastern artisans and merchants. Others emphasize that most silk was imported well into the late Middle Ages, making it a luxury reserved for the elite. Back in your workshop, you watch as a weaver carefully integrates silk threads into a wool tapestry. The shimmer contrasts beautifully with the matte wool, creating highlights that catch the flickering candlelight. This technique, combining fibers, added richness and texture to textiles, elevating them from practical to exquisite. Now, for a fringe tidbit, in some courts, silk was believed to have mystical properties. Wearing silk was thought to ward off evil spirits or even cure ailments. Some cultures believed that silk's sheen reflected the wearer's soul, making it a fabric not just of status, but of spiritual significance. You recall a story from the workshop. A noble woman's silk gown was stolen, leading to a scandal that rippled through the court for months. The thief was never found, but rumors swirled that the fabric itself carried a curse. Perhaps the wrath of a jealous goddess or the victim's insulted pride. You laugh softly to yourself, thinking about curses and costumes. Medieval life was never short on drama, but the real drama lay in the business of silk. Trading silk meant navigating complex alliances, paying hefty tariffs, and outsmarting competitors. Venetian merchants, with their powerful fleets, dominated much of the Mediterranean silk trade by the 13th century, wielding influence that rivaled kings. The wealth generated fueled the Renaissance, funding art, architecture, and science. You trace a finger along the delicate silk threads in your hands, marveling at how this fragile fabric shaped history. And it wasn't just Europe. Silk influenced fashion, politics, and culture from Japan to Persia to the farthest reaches of Africa. It was a thread connecting worlds, a tangible piece of globalization long before the term existed. As evening descends, the workshop grows quiet. You fold your silk sample carefully, aware that you've held a piece of history in your hands. Silk is more than cloth. It's a story of adventure, ambition, and human connection woven across continents. And tonight, it whispers its secrets to you. The morning mist clings to the stone walls of the cathedral as you step into a quiet workshop nestled in its shadow. The air here is thick with the scent of incense and beeswax, mingled with the faint but persistent odor of damp wool and wood shavings. Today's lesson takes you into the sacred realm of church vestments, the garments worn by priests, bishops, and monks during ceremonies that echoed with ancient chants and whispered prayers. You find yourself surrounded by bolts of rich fabric, many embroidered with gold thread and encrusted with tiny jewels. The colors are deep and vibrant, crimson, violet, gold, chosen for their symbolism and solemnity. The cloth feels heavier here, weighted with centuries of reverence. Your mentor, a monk with kind eyes and calloused hands, explains that creating church vestments is both a craft and a sacred duty. Every stitch must honor the divine, every thread woven with prayer. The workshop is a place where art meets spirituality. Here's your historical fact. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was one of the largest patrons of textile production. Elaborate vestments, altar cloths, and tapestries were commissioned from skilled artisans across Europe. The Church's demand for luxurious fabrics helped drive innovation in weaving, dyeing, and embroidery techniques. Some churches owned entire workshops dedicated to producing sacred textiles. You watch as an apprentice carefully applies gold thread embroidery, forming intricate patterns of crosses, vines, and saints. The gold thread itself is a marvel. Thin strips of gold hammered flat and sewn onto the fabric with painstaking precision. It gleams softly in the candlelight, capturing the flicker of flames as if holding divine fire within. But not all is solemn in the workshop. You notice one monk struggling to suppress a sneeze in the midst of the incense-heavy room. The combination of dust, smoke, and pollen from nearby gardens makes breathing a challenge. Yet they carry on with quiet dedication. An unusual tidbit. In some monasteries, monks would fast during the creation of vestments, believing that spiritual purity enhanced the sanctity of the garments. Others would fast during certain colors or weaving processes, aligning their work with the liturgical calendar. The act of weaving and embroidering was often considered a form of prayer itself. Your mentor pauses to tell you a story about a vestment that supposedly bore a miraculous stain, a discoloration believed to be a sign from God. Pilgrims traveled for miles to see it, hoping for blessings. Whether the stain was divine or merely a spill of wine, no one could say, but the belief gave the garment power beyond its fabric. The scholarly debate in this domain revolves around the degree of monastic involvement in textile production. Were monks primarily craftsmen or overseers employing lay artisans? Some historians emphasize monastic self-sufficiency, while others highlight the outsourcing of work to secular workshops. The truth, like most medieval tales, is complex and varied by region and time. You examine a pair of ornate chasubles, sleeveless outer garments worn by priests. Their surfaces shimmer with silk and gold, embroidered with symbols representing Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the Apostles. The designs are so detailed they almost seem to move in the flickering light. You wonder how many hands touch these fabrics before they grace the altar. Later, your mentor invites you to try your hand at embroidery. Your fingers tremble as you pick up the delicate gold thread, trying to follow the intricate patterns. It's slow work. Every stitch must be precise. A single mistake could unravel hours of effort. As you work, you realize that church textiles are not merely clothing. They're vessels of faith, communication, and identity. They convey power, mystery, and a connection to something larger than the material world. As dusk settles, the workshop quiets except for the soft murmur of prayers from the cathedral. You fold your unfinished embroidery, heart full of awe. In this space, weaving becomes worship, and every thread is a whispered prayer. The sound of distant hammering and the faint clatter of carts fills the morning air as you make your way back to the weaving workshop. But something is different today. The usual hum of spinning wheels and the rhythmic beat of looms is quieter, more tentative. Whispers circulate among the workers. Machines change. The future. The loom you've known all your life, the sturdy wooden frame you can navigate with closed eyes, faces a challenge unlike any before. You're about to witness the beginning of the end of the handloom era. The Industrial Revolution is still centuries away, but the seeds of mechanization have begun to sprout in the 15th century, particularly with the invention of devices like the draw loom and the early use of mechanical spinning wheels. These innovations promise to speed up production, reduce manual labor, and change the social fabric of weaving forever. You approach a new contraption, a draw loom. It looks more complex than any loom you've seen, with extra pedals and pulleys. A master weaver demonstrates how this machine can produce intricate patterns faster and more consistently than traditional methods. The excitement is palpable but tinged with apprehension. If machines can do the work of skilled hands, what will happen to apprentices like you? Your mentor catches your eye and murmurs, "Progress, but at a price." You sit down to try the draw loom. The extra pedals and levers overwhelm your senses. The rhythm is different, less human, more mechanical. Yet the cloth produced is undeniably fine, with patterns more precise than you ever managed. Here's a historical fact. The draw loom was developed in China centuries earlier, but made its way to Europe during the late medieval period. It allowed weavers to produce complex figured fabrics that were previously time-consuming or impossible by hand. This technology laid the groundwork for later industrial machines and marked a turning point in textile production. The fringe detail. In some places, weavers resisted mechanization, fearing the loss of craftsmanship and their livelihoods. There were even incidents of machine-breaking riots where skilled workers destroyed early mechanical looms to protect their trade. This tension between tradition and innovation is as old as technology itself. The scholarly debate. Historians argue over whether these early mechanizations were primarily driven by economic pressures or by a genuine desire to innovate and expand markets. Some see them as the harbingers of capitalism, while others emphasize the preservation of guild traditions and artisanal pride. You notice that while the machine promises efficiency, it lacks the intimacy of the hand loom. The subtle variations, the human touch, the stories woven into every irregularity, these are lost. You wonder what will become of the songs sung by spinners, the whispered blessings over the warp, and the laughter shared in workshops. Your mentor nods at your pensive expression. "Machines make cloth," she says softly, "but only humans weave history." You take a deep breath and return to your loom, steady hands returning to familiar motions. The wooden frame creaks in welcome, the shuttle slides back and forth, the beaters fall in rhythm. You realize that while machines may change the way cloth is made, the spirit of weaving, of connection, of craft, of culture remains human. As dust settles and the workshop quiets, you look around at the faces of fellow weavers. Some are hopeful, others wary. All are part of a moment of transformation. You fold your cloth carefully, the fibers holding both the past and the uncertain future. Tomorrow will bring new threads, new patterns, new challenges. But tonight, you rest, wrapped in the timeless rhythm of the hand loom. The day draws to a gentle close as you sit by the hearth, fingers lightly tracing the soft woolen cloth resting in your lap. This final stretch of your weaving journey is bittersweet, a moment to reflect on the countless threads you've pulled, twisted and woven into fabric, and the centuries of human hands that did the same. Now, the art you've come to know so intimately begins to fade, its vibrant legacy quietly folding into history. You think back to the first time you saw raw fleece, tangled and greasy, and how far you've come, from crude socks to noble robes, from dyes steeped in pea to shimmering silks, carried on camel caravans. Every thread you wove is a stitch in the vast tapestry of human endeavor. The world outside continues on, villagers winding down, fires crackling low, and a soft wind weaving through the thatched roofs. Inside, the workshop is still. The looms rest, the shuttles sit idle, and the scent of wool and earth lingers, a gentle reminder of work done and stories told. As you fold your final piece, the familiar rhythm of the loom echoes softly in your mind. Thunk, beat, pass, pull, like a lullaby sung across generations. It's a cadence that once shaped lives, marked seasons, and bound communities. The art of medieval weaving wasn't just about fabric. It was about connection. Connection to the land, to the animals that gave their wool, to the women and men who spun and wove in flickering candlelight, to the families who wore these cloths in moments of joy and sorrow. You recall the stories, the secret societies of women guilds, the magic whispered in dye vats, the political weight of patterns and colors. Every stitch was a statement, every thread a voice. Even as mechanization threatens to silence hand looms, the spirit of weaving endures. It lives in museum halls, in whispered legends, in the occasional skein spun by a modern craftsperson honoring ancient ways, and it lives in you. You feel the fibers beneath your fingers, warm and soft, threaded with memory and meaning. It's okay to rest now, to let your mind drift with the gentle hum of the past and the soothing promise of dreams. Imagine the wool stretching softly under your touch, the scent of lavender and worn leather fading into night air. Feel the slow pulse of history wrapping around you like a comforting cloak. You're safe here, cradled in the quiet rhythm of looms long stilled but never forgotten. So let your breath slow, your eyelids grow heavy. Drift into a world where every thread tells a story, every fabric holds a secret, and the gentle art of weaving becomes a bridge between centuries. Sleep now. The tapestry of time continues to unfold, and you are a part of its endless weave. Good night.